Using HTML for citing works or authors can be a little tricky, especially all of the changes that have been made to the specification over the last few years. Initially, when HTML5 was released, the cite element was no longer allowed for citing the authors of works, just the works themselves. This directly contradicted the way the authors had been using the tag for years, and as you can imagine, it created a huge controversy. Well, the specification has been modified to allow authors' names within citations again, but there's still a lot of confusion out there about how to properly cite works. So what I want to do is take a look at one popular pattern. To do that, we're going to work with the trails.htm, which is found in the 0306 folder. And if I take a look at that in the browser, if I scroll down into the main article, there's something that seems a little bit off in this section for notable features. Now, by the way, if you're watching this course and you're wondering about what these blue outlines are, this is a live preview feature inside brackets, which is the editor I'm using. And it's awesome because if you have something selected in the code, it's highlighted in the page. So that's not actually part of my CSS. That's just brackets being brackets. Okay. So in notable features, there's this little paragraph right here that says Northridge Loop is easily the best loop in Ojai. You'll kick yourself if you miss it. Nick Brazzi, The Complete Guide to Trails. It's totally out of context with the surrounding paragraphs. It's not part of that section. So clearly, this is sort of a pull quote or a quotation that relates to the article but isn't actually part of the article flow itself. And so not only is this not apparent stylistically, it's not semantically apparent either. If I go back into my code and I scroll down to, say, about line 69 or so, I can see that, again, this is just enclosed in a paragraph. So there's nothing really here semantically to say, hey, this is a quotation or this is an aside or something like that. So really the best structural element for this is probably a block quote because this is a quote from an author. It pertains to the article that it's inside of. So semantically, a block quote really works here. So instead of a paragraph, I'm going to change this really quickly to a block quote. And I have to remember to do that to both the opening and the closing tags. Now, what's nice about that, if I save this, and let's just say I go back and preview that in the browser, I can see that stylistically there's a change here. Now, this is not the default styling for a block quote. I've written styles within my main.css that are going to help us style all of this already. So that's sort of already been finished, but now we're seeing that stylistically it looks different as well. All right, if I go back into my quotation here, there are really two parts of this. There's the quote itself, Northridge Loop is easily the best loop in Ojai. You'll kick yourself if you miss it. And then there's the author information and the work that's being cited, Nick Brazzi, The Complete Guide to Trails. So I need to separate these in some way as well. I would also like to have some quotation marks around Northridge Loop, around the quote, basically. Now, there are a couple of different ways to do this. I could use the HTML entity character encoding, so I could do that. Or I can use a tag. There's this neat little tag in HTML called the Q tag. And that, of course, stands for quote. So what I'm going to do is highlight all this text, and then I'm going to wrap that in a Q tag. All right, so save this. And then let's say I want to take a look at that in the browser. You can see it adds the proper quotation marks around this quote. Now, this is great for text that you want syndicated or that you want to be able to sort of pull out, and the quotation marks don't need to actually physically be there. You just want them there presentationally. This is a great tag for this, and it's well supported in all major browsers. Okay, so going back into my quote, I now need to think about how to format the citation. Now, the cite tag obviously comes into mind, but because this is inside of a block quote, I'd really like to give the block quote itself some additional structural information. Remember that block quotes, those are what we call sectioning roots, meaning anything we put inside of that doesn't affect the main document outline. So we can use headlines or other structural elements in there that really give definition and structure to the block quote without affecting the document outline. Well, one thing I'd like to do is wrap all of the author and the work information in a footer. So I'm going to highlight Nick Brazzi all the way to the Complete Guide to Trails, and I'm going to wrap that in a footer element. Now, if you think about it, structurally, a footer element really works here because footers are really supposed to be sort of the info for a particular section. So that could be copyright data. It could be the author information, that sort of thing. So footer really works here semantically and structurally to separate the quote from the actual citation itself. Now, if I save this and once again go out to the browser to take a look at it, you can see that now stylistically I can use that hook of the footer to really give a much different appearance physically to the author and the work itself. Now, I definitely want to use a cite element here. In the HTML5 specification, the cite element is used really to reference any creative work or an author of a creative work. And in this case, that sort of applies to both of them. There's Nick Brazzi and there's the complete guide to trails. So in addition to the footer, I'm going to highlight this and I'll wrap that in a cite element. Now, in this case, we have a fairly simple quote here. In other cases, you might actually have a lot more information inside the footer. So you might have contact information for the author, that sort of thing. And in those cases, that's why it's very helpful to have both the footer and the cite. We really could have left the footer off. It just gives us a little bit of additional structural integrity to the block quote. And then cite covers, in this case, both the author as well as the work that's being cited too. All right, so if I save this and go back out to the browser, I can see that stylistically in my CSS, for cite, I'm going ahead and italicizing it. And I've also aligned it over here to the right. You'll notice that having the name of the work, the complete guide to trails, italicized is probably a pretty good idea. But the author's name, I don't really want to show that italicized. I would like to give them an additional bit of visual separation, but I'd also like to semantically identify Nick as the author as well. Well, unfortunately, we don't really have that type of mechanism in HTML. And that's one of the reasons why later on in the course, we'll be talking about how to extend HTML5 with some additional vocabularies. For right now, I'm going to highlight the name Nick Brazzi, and then I'm just going to wrap that in a span tag, and I will use a class attribute of author to identify that as an author. Now, that's actually not putting out any semantic data that, say, Google or somebody else like that would scan and pick up. That's really more human readable, but it also gives us an additional styling hook. We now have a span around the author. We're giving a class of author, which is actually a semantic class name and not just something like class 1A or something like that. All right, so if I save that and then go back out to the browser, I can see that I've used that styling hook to make sure that the name Nick Brazzi is not italicized while the actual work itself is. So this is certainly not the only pattern that we could use to mark up a quote or a quotation. Many authors will use things like the figure and fig caption elements. Others will cite the work outside of the block quote. They'll do the block quote for the quote and then do the citation outside of it. I've even seen people use definition lists to do it. What really matters is that you mark quotes and citations up in the cleanest, most semantic way possible. Now, later on, we're going to explore further enhancing the semantics of our citation, but for now, this is a really solid place to start.